Hacksaw Ridge. Let's compare and contrast in a moment. Biopic about an interesting and notable American soldier, directed by an icon of cinematic masculinity. The opening scene drops us in the middle of combat, then it flashes back to a formative experience in the protagonist's childhood, then it flashes forward to the protagonist meeting a girl and joining the service, then they get married before the main character goes off to war, and then eventually we come back to where we opened. I hope that's enough examples. Judging from the box office, a hell of a lot of people really liked American Sniper. I thought it was okay. Meta. And just like American Sniper, I think Hacksaw Ridge is about a really interesting guy. And yet the movie manages to be mostly uninteresting. Andrew Garfield plays Desmond Doss, a combat medic in the Pacific Theater of World War II. Doss was notable for being a conscientious objector. He refused to even touch a gun, let alone carry one, even on the battlefield, in the middle of the fiery hell of combat.
This is a personal gift from the United States government designed to bring death to the enemy.
Well, I'm sorry, Sergeant. I can't touch a gun.
The first half of the movie documents how and why this conviction was instilled in Doss at a young age, but also how that conviction was mistaken for cowardice by his fellow soldiers in basic training, including and especially his sergeant, played by Vince Vaughn, and his captain, played by Sam Worthington. The second half of the movie takes us to the eponymous Hacksaw Ridge for the Battle of Okinawa, for close to an hour of nearly non-stop carnage. And this is where Doss's courage truly shines. I'm being purposely vague, but if you know literally anything about Desmond Doss, you know what he did at Hacksaw Ridge. I won't go into detail because it's the climax of the movie, even though the details are included in the opening paragraph of the movie's Wikipedia page. Clearly, Doss is a man of immense faith and immeasurable courage, and his story is certainly worth telling. There's a fascinating contradiction in his devotion to the thou shalt not kill commandment and in his admirable desire to serve his country during a war. It's worth noting that prior to enlisting, Doss was employed at a shipyard doing defense work, which meant he was helping the war effort in a concrete way. He even got a deferment from the US military because of it. But he wanted to do more. He wanted to be in combat and put himself in harm's way, because he didn't think it was right for other men to do so while he sat on the sidelines because of his faith.
I can't stay here while all them go fight for me.
Despite his faith being pretty explicitly non-combative. Again, interesting contradiction. And the movie's way of exploring this contradiction was 2 lines of dialogue.
You don't kill.
No, sir.
You know, quite a bit of killing does occur in war.
But there's not really anything inherently wrong with that. It's at worst a wasted opportunity, as I'm sure such an exploration would have been complex and nuanced. Not to mention it would have helped us get to the heart of who Desmond Doss really was. This is a biopic after all.
Who the hell is Private Doss?
But as long as the movie goes along other interesting routes, that's perfectly fine. So, what other interesting routes does the movie go along?
Private Doss does not believe in violence. Do not look to him to save you on the battlefield.
I don't think this is a question of religion. I think this is cowardice.
I fell in love with you because you weren't like anyone else. You're saying you could go to prison.
But I don't know how I'm gonna live with myself if I don't stay true to what I believe.
Persecution. I don't mean to belittle religious persecution because it's a real and truly awful thing that exists in the world. But according to a 2004 documentary about Doss, while he was mocked in basic training, he was never beaten, he was never put in a cell, and he was never court-martialed. I have no problem with taking a few creative liberties, but what I do have a problem with is that all of these things, which make up the narrative's main drama for the first half of the movie, are so over the top and ham-fisted, especially the court-martial scene. Is it as unbelievably exaggerated as other Christian persecution movies?
What are you doing? Are you praying?
Not even close. Does it sort of feel like these scenes are only there so that Mel Gibson can indulge in what some might call a persecution complex? Kinda. Gibson clearly respects Doss's faith, and while he's an outspoken Christian himself, doesn't seem he shares in Doss's pacifism that stems from his faith, given how affectionately he shoots the extreme violence, which honestly shouldn't surprise you given his filmography. And I have to point out that despite the hero's convictions, the movie goes out of its way to dehumanize the Japanese soldiers, presumably to make their killing justifiable. So, the movie is holding two contradictory ideas, that Doss's faith and rebuke of violence are admirable and heroic, but that the US soldiers killing the Japanese, in direct conflict with what Doss stands for, is admirable and heroic as well. As you chew on that, keep in mind that it's estimated over 100,000 Japanese civilians died in the Battle of Okinawa. I only bring this up because, to me, the movie is kind of left without a point of view, which is odd because the main character certainly has one. I'm probably nitpicking. Andrew Garfield is really good, but if I'm being honest, he was way better in Silence. A critic that I really like, who happened to love Hacksaw Ridge, said that Garfield's accent was otherwise caricature but fit into the melodramatic tone of the movie. So if the accent was intentionally a little silly and melodramatic, good job?
Every time I think about you, beats faster still.
Personally, I was so excited to see Vince Vaughn in a major role in a legit movie, a Best Picture nominee. And his character defines One Note.
Let me see your Indian war cry, son! I don't...
Not exaggerating. Jeremy in Wedding Crashers had more nuance.
I'm a little too traumatized to have a scone.
Hugo Weaving sells the hell out of his role as Doss's alcoholic father, terrified of seeing his sons enlist in World War II after seeing so many of his best friends die in World War I. But I don't really buy his character. He's set up as kind of an antagonist, and then he redeems himself. But I never really buy him as an antagonist, and I don't buy his redemption, because it's tied into an eye-roll-inducing court-martial sequence. I could make basically the same criticism for most of the supporting cast. They're set up as antagonists in the first half, even more so than Doss's father, and they're redeemed, I guess, sort of, kind of, so we can root for them in the second half. And the worst part is, none of this is surprising. How can it be? You see a specific guy being a dick to him in basic training, of course those two are going to connect in some way later in the movie. Every setup is obvious, and every payoff is predictable. And really, nothing in the movie is surprising. I find myself saying this more and more, and I don't mean to say that every movie needs a huge twist or needs to be this big puzzle, but there's a big difference between completely pulling the rug out from under the audience and following beat for beat what the audience is expecting. That being said, even if there's nothing surprising, there's still some good stuff. While Gibson may overindulge a bit in the exploding skulls and blown off limbs, he's a really talented action director. The violence is sudden, relentless, and gratuitous, but the production is top-notch. The sound editing in particular is Oscar caliber and stomach churning. Overall, I guess I feel similarly about Hacksaw Ridge as I do about Lion. It's an honest-to-goodness, interesting, true story, but maybe a little too padded with what feels like filler. Both have a pretty distinct first and second half, and in both cases I thought one half was considerably stronger than the other. And while I may not have loved it, I certainly appreciate how much Mel Gibson is in his element, with a story about faith and courage that also affords him the opportunity to show off his penchant for punishing violence. Faith and courage and punishing violence being the distinct hallmarks of his directorial filmography. All in all, you could do a lot worse than Hacksaw Ridge, particularly if you have a high tolerance for some hokiness and a really high tolerance for violence. I guess I just kind of don't.